And then we are going to give just a moment for a new person to appear where Ian has been. And while we're waiting for that last little bit of assembly to happen, I just wanted to tell you briefly about the fact that all these folks who you'll see before you on screen have very graciously this summer spent some time with me on a podcast. We decided that this was a good year to launch an idea that we'd been mulling for several years here at Nobel Conference, and that is to start a podcast. We knew that the opportunity for discussion among our panelists was going to be much more limited because of the scope of our together time this year. So each of them very graciously gave me about an hour and a half of their time to talk with me in more detail about their research, about how they came to be the scientists and social scientists that they are today, and also about how they understand the moral complexities of their work today. You can find those podcasts at ScienceWise. I think by now it's populated Spotify and a couple of other places. Hopefully someday you'll just be able to Google ScienceWise, all one word, WHYS, and find the podcast. But there are some wonderfully interesting conversations with all 7 of our Nobel Conference presenters who are now, I believe, arrayed before you. And I think perhaps they can hear me talking. Some of them are smiling, so I'm hoping that means that they are able to hear me. I'm going to introduce each person to you, and perhaps you can give a little wave or a little shout out so that we know who you are. And I'm going to do so in alphabetical order after I introduce my colleague Dwight Stoll, professor of chemistry at Gustavus, who's in the lab. Hi, Dwight.
Hi, Lisa.
And now our 7 presenters. First of all, Dr. Bissan Al-Lazikani at the Institute for Cancer Research in London. Welcome, Dr. Al-Lazikani.
Hi, thank you for having me, and nice to meet everyone.
Next, Dr. Suzanne Chambers of the University of Technology, Sydney.
Thank you, Lisa. Terrific to be here.
Dr. Chanita Hughes Halbert of the Medical University of South Carolina.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Next, Dr. Carl June, whom you heard from this morning, at the University of Pennsylvania. Looks like we're having some audio problems with Dr. June.
Sorry, I was muted, but I can actually still. But it was a great to be with this panel.
Excellent, thank you, thank you. And Dr. Charles Sawyers of Memorial Sloan Kettering.
Hi everyone, I'm really thrilled to be here and look forward to the conversation.
Next, Dr. Kathryn Schmitz of Penn State University.
Lovely to be with you all.
And finally, you just heard from Dr. Jim Thomas of Just Evotech Biologics. Biotherapeutics.
Yeah. Great to be here. Really great.
And at this point, I would like to turn it over to my colleague, Dwight Stoll.
Thanks, Lisa. So one of the really special things about the way that we construct this conference is these panel discussions. It's kind of a unique opportunity. I think a lot of the scientific conferences we participate in as professionals tend to be very focused on our own disciplines, and so this is pretty unique to be able to bring people together from very different fields. As Dr. June said yesterday, get us out of our own swim lanes. And so these panel discussions are an opportunity to do that, to reflect on what we've heard throughout the day. And in one of so it's also a great opportunity, I think, to model for students what it looks like to talk to one another across disciplinary lines. On one of the Zoom discussions I sat in on over lunchtime today, I heard a student say, well, it was great to hear in the second talk today, or I was able to see how I could connect ideas from my mathematical modeling class here at Gustavus to some of the data that Dr. Hughes Halbert was talking about. So I think the students are ready to make those connections, and this is a great opportunity for us to model that. So I think what I'd like to do is begin here by just giving each of the panelists an opportunity to sort of respond or react to the first three talks that we've heard today. That could be just a, sort of an aha moment, perhaps. Sometimes we hear those. And also, maybe a chance to answer or ask a clarifying question of one of the speakers. And so I think let's start with Dr. June. We'll go in order of the three speakers today, and then beyond that, I'll open it up sort of left to right on my screen to keep it simple.
Well, thank you. Thanks, Dwight. This is such an amazing set of coming together, and I think, so Chanita, I was wondering, to be a colleague of mine here in Philadelphia, how you fit in the new atmosphere down at MUSC, and I'd just be interested on your reflections, because you've had your feet in both camps, and then I have a second question on, which is how you're seeing research now interact with.
Well, thanks, Carl, for those questions. I'll start by saying, Penn will always be home. I, had a fantastic time there. It was a great learning experience for me to be there, and it was really the place where I feel like I cut my teeth on transdisciplinary research that really gave me the breadth and depth of understanding sort of all of the issues that are relevant for cancer and cancer prevention and minority health and health disparities. So one of the things that I think is, so one, Penn will always be home. I still miss it. But what I'll say, the opportunity at MUSC is that, it's like Penn, it is an academic medical center. We are the only NCI designated cancer center in the state. And so, that brings, I think, a unique set of responsibilities and opportunities and challenges. One is, South Carolina is very different than Charleston, and the area in which I live and work is very different than Philadelphia, but I think the challenges are the same with respect to social determinants being an important factor in how individuals are able to receive quality health care, particularly as it relates to cancer. I think that, there are challenges that are the same with respect to, I came to MUSC as they were just beginning to implement their electronic health record, and I think all institutions experience the same types of challenges. It's very difficult to implement new systems. So the things I think are the same just with being in an academic institution, but both places have really been, a fantastic learning experience and opportunities. And what was your second question, Carl?
Well, I'm just wondering now, we had issues at Penn trying to start up research in COVID, but it really almost stopped all of my experiment with cancer. Mm-hmm. Wondering what the experience was at MUSC.
So we like all I think research intensive institutions really struggled, and struggle is probably not the right word, but experienced challenges because there was a suspension of most research activities, and I think but one of the things that I think has been MUSC may have been unique, may have been prepared in a different way than other institutions, because there's been a considerable investment in developing infrastructure for telehealth and telemedicine because of the rurality that exists in the state. One of the huge sort of vision for MUSC is to be able to connect all patients to healthcare using telemedicine and telehealth. So I think that infrastructure was sort of in place, maybe more than, it'd be great to hear from the other panelists about their experiences with this as well. But I feel like MUSC was able to pivot very effectively to delivering healthcare in an alternative format. So, but we are we're part of the NCI Community Oncology Research Program. We're a minority underserved site, and one of that affected our program and our ability to enroll patients into ongoing clinical trials in a very profound way. And what was great, I think, is that NCI, which is the funder of this program, acknowledged that and really tried to work with sites to understand challenges and then be thoughtful about solutions, and sort of all of us, we're all in the same position, in the same boat. So, but things are being reactivated. My research is back in as much swing as I think it can be at the moment. But it is, it's a evolving work in progress, I think. What's it been like for you?
Yeah, we had, almost a complete cessation of all our experimental therapies, which, if you're a cancer patient, that's something you would like. Yeah. And I just got the numbers for September, and finally we're back up on enrollment.
Mm-hmm.
But it took a lot longer than I thought to get the machinery and infrastructure working
Mm-hmm.
again.
Right. Yeah. So it is. I think it's it's one of the billboards that that is on Highway 26 is when you can't change the situation, you change yourself. And so I think we're all kind of a little bit in that boat, right? Because there are a lot of things that we can't control during this time, but we can control how we respond to them. But how have others sort of been dealing with research activities during COVID, or as a result of COVID?
Well, we're still quite engaged, in our company. We've had to keep people, separated, social distancing. We've had a lot of procedures that we put in place to make sure that employees are safe. But we've continued on at a little bit slower pace, but I think we're kind of getting used to engagement in this arena. I was actually going to ask a question, Chanita, about. I didn't even know your field existed, so here's my ignorance, and so I think it's great, and I think it's great, and it's so needed. It's so needed. So you're finding out actually so much about patient access in minority groups, and finding out things, getting the information, getting it on the ground, getting access is challenging. What do you see as some of the best, perhaps, way or solutions that you're finding? You're finding a lot of important data about what's preventing access. What are the most promising approaches or ways to actually getting that access for these people really important?
So the video was a little choppy, so I'll just repeat the question to make sure I heard it. So the question was, what are some of the most effective ways for improving access? Is that the question?
Yeah. Yes.
Thank you. I think that there are a couple that that really rise to the top. One is using an approach where patients are connected with services using what's called a navigator model. And navigators can work, in a variety of settings across the continuum of cancer. There's a evidence base about the effectiveness of patient navigation to helping individuals get into cancer screening and to diagnosis. One of my trainees, Evan Grayboys, is a head and neck surgeon who's been working to develop a patient navigation that's more integrated into the clinical space, and it's working, and it's shown in a preliminary way that navigators can help reduce delayed access to post-operative radiation therapy among individuals who have head and neck surgery. So what's been great about this work, one is that he's sort of taking this evidence-based model, applying it within sort of a unique space within cancer treatment, is that it's being led by a physician surgeon who is really sort of taken to an interest in understanding behavioral science and behavioral science methods and behaviorally oriented interventions. So patient navigation is one of the ways that I think has been one of the most effective ways to reduce access. I think and why I think it works is because it enables patients to talk about and work with someone one-on-one to address their individual barriers. So barriers can be, you don't know about what to do. Another barrier is you're afraid to do what you know you need to do, or there are other, and that those are kind of the two main barriers that are relevant to cancer. So navigators really work within that space of helping people to resolve their unique sets of challenges. Shreya Kangovi, who's an internal medicine physician at Penn, actually, has done some really amazing work with creating a community patient navigation center. I forget what the name of the center is, but the navigators really work with the patients to address social needs and more socially oriented determinants. I think that's really the next opportunity and really space where we need to work, is to provide navigation that addresses unmet social needs. So what the literature tells us and what studies have shown is that patients are, I think in many ways, have the best intentions to follow through with the recommendations that are made by their providers. But financial costs, financial hardship, particularly, not just about paying a medical bill, but paying like your electricity bill, your mortgage, your rent, are the things that reduce being able to do what your provider has recommended that you do. And so navigating patients to address unmet social needs is really important, and I think sort of will bridge the gap between the expert care that's provided in a clinical setting and the community and neighborhoods in which patients live, in which they actually have to manage their chronic conditions, manage treatment-related side effects, manage all the things that come with living a healthier lifestyle.
Okay, thanks. Great. So we've heard a little bit from our first three speakers today. Leftmost on my screen up next is Dr. Al-Lazikani. Do you have any reactions to the first talks today?
I guess maybe, one of the questions that I'd really loved to get the opinion of the panelists today, but also everyone maybe, is, is it right that we could think of a future where the availability of technology, in a way that, in reality, phones are cheaper than most other things, than, for example, healthcare bills, that will somehow enable us to level the playing field in cancer care, and especially around the early detection of cancer, which is something that I'm increasingly worried and passionate about. So maybe Chanita could start in your opinion of how you think, for example, is it the case that maybe if we take it in another way, for example, the world was speaking an awful lot about internet poverty, broadband poverty in developing countries, for example. And then we saw that developing countries kind of skipped an entire generation that more developed countries did, and went straight into mobile broadband, and actually, quite rapidly are catching up with what's available in more developed countries. So thinking of this kind of model, can we, or do we see a trajectory where the availability of these mobile technologies, maybe at a cost level that is more accessible to more people, can be used effectively in order to start bridging this gap, especially around cancer early detection?
Sure. So I can start. And I do think there's a significant potential with technology, health information technology, to bridge and fill several important gaps. I think we're learning that now during COVID, where we have now an option in many healthcare situations to do a visit virtually, and if you're and I think that makes a big difference. So I think to the extent that technology can be and is being leveraged effectively, I think will address many gaps. I do have concerns. I think that health information technology, while important and critical, it has significant potential. I think that I would have concerns about relying on it as, and sort of putting it forward as the only or primary means of interacting with patients. I say that because here in North Carolina, as an example, there's still parts of the state that are very rural that don't have high-speed connectivity, and the connectivity that we do have can be sporadic. So I think that is an area of concern. So while someone might have a cell phone, being able to connect to the speeds that are necessary to have a telemedicine visit can be, may not be uniform, and you might be exacerbating disparities or creating new disparities because you don't have the latest and the sort of the technical capacity. I think there's also the potential for there to generate, there's a, I would call, as I was talking to the students today, I was reminded that my first job out of college was as a network administrator. And, but if you ask me to fix something on the computer now, I would really be challenged. And so, I rely on my 13-year-old son to kind of help me understand a little bit more about the technology. So I do think that there is the potential for older adults to have less exposure to technology and be less willing to use technology. And so, as our population ages, I think there's the potential for a growing to be left out of sort of this technology wave. But Katie, I think, might have some thoughts about this, because it's a huge emphasis on, using technology to promote exercise and healthy eating. And I wondered what your thoughts were about this.
Yeah, so thanks for asking. I was actually going to ask you about the digital divide as well as the your experience, Chanita, of the differences in the population. I was at Penn as well. Chanita and I had the opportunity to work together there, I have now moved, as she has, to a more rural setting, and I have found that the patient population is different at Penn State in Hershey, Pennsylvania, than they are in Philadelphia. And I have got to believe that that is the same for you, Chanita, at the Medical University of South Carolina. I think that, I really appreciated the issue of, thinking about, the developing countries are coming along in a very nice way with broadband. Well, Pennsylvania is not. They have a statewide report that just came out. We're the sixth most populous state in the country, and we have an extremely robust rural health research arm of the legislature in our state, and they did a very extensive report on the availability of broadband. And we have a massive problem in the state of Pennsylvania that, I think is a canary in the coal mine. I don't think it's just Pennsylvania. I think that Pennsylvania just happens to be well funded with this kind of research. And what they found was that the commercial entities that are providing broadband are indicating that there is broadband in places where there is no broadband. That in fact, we do not have the availability of telehealth and telemedicine that we would like to believe that we have. I will also say that I think that there is something clearly very different that I experience in central Pennsylvania as compared to in Philadelphia. And it is not just an issue of the difference in the racial makeup. I think that there are cultural differences in more rural places in the United States, but around the world, that I think make an enormous difference in terms of some of the access issues that we're discussing. For example, at Penn State, one of the things that I have had to deal with that I think is relevant to the work of Dr. Thomas, Dr. June, the talks we heard today, all of our work. When I'm going to recruit a patient in the chemotherapy infusion suite, and I'm trying to explain what a randomized controlled trial is, and I'm educating about the concept of clinical trials, I automatically have a conflict of interest. There's a conflict of interest if I'm educating about what clinical trials are in the first place. How can I then try to enroll someone in my clinical trial? That's a conflict. So I think that there is a lot of variability in access that is even beyond technology. It's a basic educational difference in people's willingness to participate in the research enterprise. The idea of being a part of a clinical trial is not an obvious thing for people outside of NCI designated cancer centers. I do not work for an NCI designated cancer center. Penn State is not designated by NCI. We operate as much as a community oncology center as an academic medical center. And the patient population reflects that. I'd like to just note that while there is brilliance here and brilliance at all of those cancer centers, 85% of cancer care in the United States is delivered in the community. The vast majority of minority individuals who receive cancer care in our country receive that cancer care in the community, in the kind of programs that Chanita was talking about are funded by NCI, but a lot of them aren't involved in those NCI programs.
Could I just do a really quick timeout terminology check? Could you describe or explain to us what NCI means and why that's relevant in the world of cancer? Anyone?
Oh my goodness, I should be the one to do that.
I have a feeling you all know.
It's the National Cancer Institute, based in Washington, or Bethesda.
And why is that relevant?
Well, it's a source of
largest funder of cancer research. Yeah, it's the largest funder of cancer research in the country, and the National Cancer Institute has a program of designation of cancer institutes. There are, I believe, at this point, 46 or so designated cancer centers that are comprehensive cancer centers. And what that means is that they have at least 3 different research programs, including a population health research program, which is where I would be housed if a designated cancer center. There are also another 80 or so designated clinical cancer centers across the country. But the point is that those are the cream of the crop across our country,
Thanks.
and a great deal of cancer care is delivered in the United States, and of course, obviously beyond the United States, in places that are not that cream of the crop.
Thanks. That's helpful.
All right, thank you.
If I
Yeah, go
May I
ahead.
be greedy and sort of change tack a little bit and ask a question of Carl, really an educational question, if you may educate me. So immunotherapy in general has been probably the most exciting thing to happen in cancer therapy for the past few years, and almost any patient that comes to us at the moment, there's an immediate thinking, can we enroll them on an immunotherapy trial of one sort or another? And of course, there's a big difference between the CAR T cell work that you do and some of the sort of other immunotherapeutics. But I guess for me, it feels with immunotherapies, it's so powerful, but it's very much having a tiger by the tail. You have to really know how to control this tiger, and it shifts its head this way or that way, and you completely lose control. Can you give me your opinion on how you see the future of immunotherapy developing in order to make sure that it can become much more widely usable, perhaps with less of the risks and less of the sort of need for active management that comes with it?
Yeah. So part of it is it's new, and so we're still discovering the best practices on how to deliver it, who's most eligible. One of the risk is different from chemotherapy. So where immunotherapy, the main risk probably long term is, autoimmune disease. That runs rampant in my family. My daughter has arthritis, which I mentioned today, and she excluded all those patients from our cancer trials. And so the issue, which is the ethics of that. I mean, there are patients who wanted to be on, but because they had diabetes or something, they were not eligible. So that was something the federal government said, and Food and Drug Administration, that you're not eligible if you have an active immune disease. And just learning about that, is it safe to treat those patients? And I think the answer is sometimes it is, and sometimes it's not. You can trigger, for instance, in someone who's had a kidney transplant, if you come and then they get cancer, then treat them with some of these immunotherapies, have rejected their organs. And for instance, in a kidney transplant, they're dialysis. So what's the relative value of that? A really complex question of, priorities and so on. So we're seeing that, we have first code. The closer you are to a major cancer, the best survival kind of therapies that you're going to see Charles Sawyers discuss tomorrow. Targeted therapies and immunotherapies. It's the rural areas really are left behind on this, so that the disparities are getting much better, I think. It's going to take a duration of the defense getting trained and learning how to do that before they can go out to the rural areas and do this. There's a shortage of trained labor now, and meaning the physicians who know how to target therapies. So that wasn't something I anticipated. It's go back when I first started training, it was bone marrow transplantation. And at the time in the early 80s, there was only really 2 places you did it. They were Hopkins in Baltimore, or at the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Center where I trained in Seattle. and people thought it would never really be generally available. Now, more than bone marrow transplants done, it has been learned how to do it at many community hospitals. You can do, but it took a generation. So we have a problem, to address the disparities of mobility, and just like the broadband path problem that Kathryn was covering. It's amazing that we have that.
All right, thank you. Dr. Chambers, do you have any initial reactions so far today?
So thank you. It's great to be part of this conversation. A comment that is going around in my head is that we're talking about disparities, and certainly in my country we have disparities that look like they're based on rurality, but when you dig into the data, they're actually socioeconomic. And despite bringing in cancer control plans and distributing services through regional areas and a whole lot of things that we are doing, those disparities are actually getting worse. They're not getting better. And as new innovations in treatment come online, what we know is that those people that are already disadvantaged are not going to get access to them by and large. So I feel like as behavioural scientists and clinicians, what we tend to do is we focus on the thing that we think we might be able to influence, which is changing the individual's behaviour, when in fact the disparity and the disadvantage is structural and comes from our social structure inequities in resources. So there's an extent to which I would throw out the idea that we're kind of like on this treadmill where if we can just get these people to be more proactive, be more agent, do this, do that, we're going to get them better, and they're going to do better without going, you know what, they've got no resources, they're not getting education, and they're not going to. The way our society is going, and COVID is, of course, just making these inequities worse. The people who are, again, more disadvantaged by any big health threat are the poor. So I don't have an answer to that, and it's just something I know that I struggle with. And in our rural areas, we do research where we go, maybe it's stoicism or fatalism, and then we go, nope, socioeconomic, and maybe it's the distance from the treatment centre. No, actually, in the end, when you do all your work, it comes back to socioeconomic disparities. So as researchers in cancer who make our living in this way, what's our responsibilities in the face of knowing, which I think we all do, that socioeconomic inequalities are the things that are leading to these disparities?
So I think that's a really great point. And, as you were talking, it made me think about, sort of the nature and why I made a decision to use a participatory approach, and the work that I was doing related to cancer and minority health and health disparities. So community-based participatory research is an approach that engages diverse stakeholders in, one, defining what the problem is, second, developing strategies to address that particular problem, and then, at the last phase, working to disseminate and implement, effective approaches beyond the research setting. So with the ultimate goal of using research and findings from research to change practice. So I think that, to my way of thinking, you're right. And I remember having, a lot of discussion with our community partners in Philadelphia about what and how we focused on. And there were a lot of concern about, our efforts that focus on individual behavior change to not really address challenges in the built environment, and as they dealt with physical activity or dietary behaviors. And I think, so acknowledging that that's really important and essential, I do think, there are things that I think, we can do as researchers, and we have to do, and one of which is to help people to be better able to navigate their own particular situation by having the best understanding of what they need to do and how they need to do it and the resources that they need to do it. And with that knowledge, I think comes power for them to advocate with their elected officials, with all of our elected officials, to make the changes in the built environment that are important. So one conversation, comes to my mind, which is, in our partnership, which was called the West Philadelphia Consortium to Address Disparities. One of the, our long-term goal in the next phase of our research, if I had stayed at Penn, this is what we would have been doing, would have been to, we had done work looking at, risk education, which led to improvements in being physically active, but not changes in dietary behaviors. So the next phase of our research was really to train community members to be advocates for, to help them to increase their skill and confidence and their belief that they could do something to change the environment in which they lived. I think we're seeing now, we're as a country, that peaceful protests can do a couple of things. One, raise awareness of an issue, and then two, begin serious conversations about changing the social environment. And so, so just to maybe bring the point to a close is that, I agree with you that, focusing on individual behavior to the exclusion or not thinking about the longer term trajectory of addressing issues in the built environment, which are due to socioeconomic characteristics and differences, is a very limited way of thinking because, for all that, we can do to change someone's behavior, if they don't have the environment to support it, it's really, I don't think it'll have the intended outcome that we want and need as a society. But I do think, working together with diverse stakeholders, and this could be community residents. I often think about communities as, being defined by professional activities. So healthcare providers are a type of community, but working, sort of defining these different stakeholders and bringing them all, engaging them all in the process of thinking about, well, what should we be working on? What can we change both on, at different levels of influence is critically important. And that multi-level approach is something that has just recently, I think, become a focal point for population health and health disparities research. Up until maybe 4 or 5 years ago, we had been working really sort of at one level to change a particular behavior or change a clinical setting. And now we're recognizing that we have to sort of engage and address multiple levels simultaneously to have the greatest benefit.
All right, great. How about Dr. Sawyers? Any initial reactions from you so far?
Yeah, I'd actually like to hear a little bit more from Jim on the challenge of enhancing access to innovative medicines. And there's a lot of complexity here to unpack. But one is, obviously it's we've even heard it from the current administration about the higher prices in the U.S. versus favored nations and so forth, and we have these executive orders. We also, we have a patent system that's meant to reward innovation, but there's an expiry, and we know about generic industry is a, I guess we probably get different opinions around the circle, but I think it has been somewhat successful in leveling the playing field after a certain period of time, and the barrier to entry into making a generic small molecule is not that high, and a lot of us are probably aware that companies in India and China are very good at generating these small molecules. But Jim, as you discussed, biosimilars are a little trickier. But what I've seen is that they're welcomed in Europe, in particular, in other countries. There's the price differential is not as dramatic a drop as with a small molecule generic, because I guess there's a higher barrier to entry, and so there's fewer competitors. But you made a great point in your lecture about, improving efficiencies of manufacturing and so forth. But another thing I'm aware of from the U.S. perspective is this incredible, maybe frustrating legal system that extends the patents again and again, and almost prevents biosimilar entry in the U.S. So there's a lot in there, but I'd love to hear what you think about all that.
Yeah. Thanks, Charles. Yeah, it's a big challenge overall. I think as we move forward, I think the cost of these therapeutics will go down. Biosimilars, as you said, there's more of a challenge there because we do have to repeat some of the clinical pathway. At this point, we can extrapolate from one indication into other indications, but there has to be some clinical data generated with biosimilars because it's impossible to make. It's not impossible, but I'd say it's incredibly difficult to make them identical like a small molecule. So I think I'm hoping the regulations will improve over time so that we can actually move forward based on analytical data alone and not actually have to do a lot of clinical studies or a small amount, very small amount of clinical, generated clinical data. So we don't have to incur that cost and load that onto the molecule. So that's one potential solution is that if we get good enough at this, we can make and show that these molecules are virtually identical, and the bits that may not be identical are really not going to cause a safety issue and certainly not going to cause an efficacy issue. In terms of the patents, I think we need to look at patents, overall and strategies there. I think there are a lot of companies who are protecting their market for these blockbuster drugs. And they'll use different strategies to extend formulation patents and other patents that will extend the life of exclusivity associated. And I think that's a shame because that is really against the spirit of actually the patents themselves and then giving access to others to come in and produce biosimilars and make them competitive and drive the cost down through competition. So I do think we need a bit of reform in that space. I think once we get something worked out, we have the opportunity to reduce the cost of these drugs through the manufacturing and so forth. I'm very keen on that because it's not only for this country, but it's also for the rest of the world. They need to access these great therapeutics that we have access to, although not perfectly. We have access to them in this country, but most of the planet doesn't at all. And I think it's through biosimilars, it's through improved technology and manufacturing and those kind of things that will help increase that access. But we need it here too. We need it in this country as well. So I don't think I perfectly answered the question, but that's a shot at it.
Thank you.
Okay, sounds great. Well, that makes our first sort of survey through the panel. I'd like to shift gears just a little bit. As you know, we've been collecting questions from the audience throughout the day, and throughout the day, I've been working to kind of identify some themes that have emerged from that, and would like to ask some of those specific questions now. So, I guess the first question is about for Dr. Jun, and it is about sort of the long-term versus short-term scope, I guess, of cell therapy. So you mentioned how the expectation right now is that in some cases the cells will have the engineered cells will have long lives in the patient, in other cases shorter. And so is there a clear advantage to having a case where the cells have a shorter life expectancy, I guess, in the patient? I think you're muted.
Okay, I hope now I'm unmuted. And it's a great question, Dwight. I think it's surprisingly complex answer to your question. So, and I'll just give a few examples. We know some tumors you can go with a few months of chemotherapy, and longitudinally, and like some lymph, it's called R-CHOP. 6 months, you're about half the patients, and they're done. But if it's a tumor B cell, lymphoma, but if you look at this cell in that's younger body, it hasn't differentiated much, then it makes acute leukemia. And it's been shown that in adults and kids, you need years of chemotherapy. And so same basic cell that's younger, maybe closer to a cell, takes a lot longer to eradicate. So, and it turns out our data so far, CAR T cells is that persistence matters in case of acute leukemia, the form that takes a lot of long-term therapy with chemotherapy and but for the lymphoma, the response rates are the same, whether you have a CAR that only lasts in the body about 3 months, whether you have last forever. So it's unfortunate, it's going to be tumor dependent. Another issue, I think, that the reason some people get cancers is basically they're predisposed. So, they have DNA repair problems, and they may create tumors. And, for instance, in women's cancer with the so-called BRCA1 and BRCA2, up until we'll get bilateral breast cancer or bilateral ovarian cancer. And so there, and a CAR T cell or some engineered cell therapy that persists may prevent a second primary. And so consider, I think what you want would be the same thing as what Charles wants, which is control. It's physician controlled, on how long the therapy persists and can you adjust it. That's what we need to have. And there's ways to get there.
Okay, great, thanks. That reminds me of lots of occasions with talking with my students where we have a situation like this, and you say this coin has two sides. It's on the one hand a great area for scientific study because it's complicated, but also frustrating sometimes when there's not a clear answer. But that's really helpful. Thank you very much. My next question is for Dr. Hughes Halbert, and that is, in your work to identify these social determinants, are you ever worried about this wasn't the audience person's words, but what I would call implicit bias in the mechanisms that are used to identify the social determinants? So can you just talk a little bit about that? How you think about that?
Sure. I think that's a really important point and concern, because we know from prior studies that there is a strong potential for stereotypes and implicit bias to play a role in, the patient-physician interaction, and those stereotypes and implicit bias can influence what is recommended to a patient or what's not recommended to a patient. So one of the things that I think is really important is, and to the approach that we've been taking, is one, to understand the nature and distribution of how social determinants are currently being documented in the electronic health record. One, to understand, are they documented, yes or no? And then in what words are they being documented? And do that process of documentation differ between patients based on their racial and ethnic background, their gender, and the types of conditions that they have. So that's really the first stage of the empirical, the research process. The second phase, which I think is essentially important, is to examine and determine the concordance between what a healthcare provider has documented in the patient's record as being an unmet social need or an adverse or social risk factor, and what the patients have actually said. So looking at that concordance, I think, between what patients self-report as their perceptions of stress, their financial hardship, their social isolation, and how much that matches with what's reported, what, if anything, is reported, yes or no, and then what's reported in the electronic health record is critically important, because I would argue that when social factors come into play, the person actually living their life in their community outside of the clinical setting is the gold standard data that we want to make sure that's being reflected in the electronic health record. And then based on sort of that phase of research, we would have a couple of different options or opportunities to pursue. One is along the lines of, I think, a quality improvement initiative where, we educate providers about what social determinants are, what are ways to document them effectively and accurately in the electronic health record. And then to provide that, establish the infrastructure to facilitate that process in the electronic health record systems. So one way I think that's moving now is that the CMS has created ICD-10 codes that providers can use to document social strain, financial hardship, and other types of social determinants. Those aren't being widely used now, and I think there's an opportunity to really focus on provider education about what those social determinants are and how they should be documented. I think there's a challenge because it makes me think of when I was first involved in medical education as a lecturer. There's we tend to think in like groups, and there could be, and there have been lectures about African Americans think this way, Hispanics think this way, and then without understanding sort of the uniqueness and the individuality that patients bring. So it's a concern, I think, but as I said, I think there are ways that we can, one, understand and document and determine how much of a concern it is, and then sort of go from there in terms of how we improve the quality of those documentation and of social determinants. And then just as importantly, how we deliver, help patients to navigate whatever social risk factors that they have. I think there's a reason why patients may not talk about financial strain. They may not talk about stressors in their life. And I think those are, we have to understand what the reasons for that, and to create and develop multi-level interventions to address that.
All right, great, thank you. My next question is for Dr. Thomas, and the spirit of the set of questions is kind of around sustainability of these new manufacturing approaches. You briefly mentioned in your talk the idea of single use, and which is very different from sort of the conventional manufacturing model, which involves huge stainless steel tanks and a lot of water washing and things like that. So can you just comment on that? Like, how do you think about the sustainability of these new, more nimble approaches when it comes to topics like single use?
Yeah, I mean, that's an important question. I think in Seattle, we're pretty strong environmentalists, right? In a way, so we pay a lot of attention to that. If you look at this approach and you look at the overall environmental impact of let's say the new approach with single use, but it's a lot of other technologies too that we're employing, and you compare that to the older, more conventional stainless steel, which is involved in helping to develop too. So I can kind of see both sides of the equation. The environmental impact is a lot lower, actually, because of the way that we clean the large, the caustics, how we have to operate these large facilities, the amount of water usage, the amount of waste that's associated with these. The environmental footprint is smaller, it's lower. In terms of the plastics, that's an important question. We're working in ways of recycling those plastics, so that we can, efficiently address that part of the equation. They're not as simple to recycle as a water bottle, that we drink out of, because of the complexity, multi layers, and so forth. But we believe that's possible. We're working with consultants and a company in that space. I think the industry is as well, but that's something definitely we need to But we think from a longer term perspective, it's definitely a much more sustainable way to actually do this. The energy input, everything associated with this is much more efficient. It's been much more deployable because of that, right, to other locations. It's a whole different approach to actually doing this type of work. So we are obviously quite strong believers in this, but it's through a lifetime, a career, I guess, experience that we gain this sort of perspective.
All right, great. Thank you. It's good to hear that the outlook is good in that category as well. Another question for you, Dr. Thomas, but also some of the other panelists. I think it's been kind of interesting to me to realize today that we haven't even gotten to Dr. Al-Lazikani's talk tomorrow about AI, and in fact, AI machine learning has come up several times already today. So a couple questions about that, and one is just sort of the old adage, I guess, that about garbage in, garbage out, that artificial intelligence and machine learning is only as good as the training data that goes into it. So that's one question. What do you see as some of the challenges associated with getting good training data for these models? And secondly, are there risks of false negatives in that exercise? That is sort of incorrectly overlooking a really good candidate molecule. Do you worry about that?
Yeah, I can address the first part of that. When we look at molecular design, and I think I mentioned in your talk, there are hundreds of thousands of sequences that we reference, that are in the public domain, and then we are generating a lot of sequence information ourselves. So there is a training set, but we're trying to grow the training set because, when you use these tools, the bigger the data set, the better. So you can, big data is like that's a Google approach in clicks, right? So that gets into the billions and billions and billions of, data points. We're not in that world of big data, but we're trying to generate as much data as possible at every step. That's why we rely on a lot of robotics. A lot of what we do, we try to turn this whole enterprise upside down. Instead of being just experts in these different fields that are doing experiments, we have experts in these different fields doing experiments in a way that we're generating the maximum amount of data so that we can apply machine learning tools across a common data set and more efficiently learn from them. We do validate, though, at every step. So if we predict that this molecule is going to be better than that molecule, we usually predict there'll be several, and we'll test all of those. So we actually will make them physically, take them out of the in silico space and actually make them physically, and then run a battery of assays on them in a high throughput format, and ask the question, were we correct or not in our prediction? And then, if depending on the answer, we'll feed it right back in to our model, right? But we're getting better and better. The beautiful thing about all of this is the more we do, the better we get, right? And now we're capturing all of the data. In my history, who knows, 90% of the data was lost from this large functional group to the next large functional group to the next large functional group, because the data systems are all different. But we've connected it all together in a common data set, and we're capturing everything. So I'm very hopeful that there's an enormous amount of progress in our space, but I also, in other areas using machine learning and AI technology.
All right, great, thanks. So now I want to, we're coming up on the close of the hour here, and I have a couple maybe questions that are kind of broader in scope that we could probably talk for a long time about, but curious to hear your thoughts, anyone who feels strongly about this. So in Dr. June's talk, he mentioned government, industry, philanthropic partnerships as being a sort of a key component of the way forward. And I guess my question is, from those kinds of partnerships that I've observed in my own research area, I observe that they're hard to pull off a lot of times, in part because the partners often have not necessarily conflicting objectives, but objectives sometimes that don't perfectly overlap. That can make it hard. Just different working cultures makes it difficult to bring these groups together. So I guess the question is quite open. What do you see as some of the major challenges to making some of these partnerships work going forward? What do we need to do?
I would be happy to make a remark.
Everyone that wants.
Yeah, Dr. Chambers.
So,
I think what's important is at the outset, there's got to be a shared mission. And if you don't actually have at least one shared central mission, you're just going to get into trouble, and it's kind of not worth your time. And then within that, there needs to be trust. I think for most of us who've worked through our career, you work out ways to establish as early on as you can whether there is in fact a shared mission, and whether these are partners that can work together in a trusting relationship. Because if you don't have that, you put a lot of effort into something that just goes nowhere.
Okay, Dr. Schmitz?
I can add to that if you want. I completely agree. There's an example that I'm involved in where the goal is to share the DNA sequencing information that comes from sequencing patients' tumors across a broad swath of cancer centers. So we're now up to 100,000 patients all collected in a common database. The ability to analyze the sequence and do science on that is actually almost plug and play now. That technology is right here. The real sort of nuggets of gold are in the electronic medical records of those patients, and curating 100,000 such records is just a non-starter. But by bringing together the interested party, in this case, a shared goal, as Kathryn said, the pharmaceutical companies really want this data matched to the genomics of the patient. So, and we pitched this as a pre-competitive set of knowledge. So it wasn't going to become, patentable or, firewalled. But if they could just pitch in together and pay for the cost of executing the project, then it was a win-win. So that project is now underway. And there's trust, et cetera. So again, it's definitely possible, and I would encourage more and more conversation about this kind of partnership.
So what I was going to add actually was I felt like Carl was missing a pillar in his talk, and I'm sure he would agree actually. And the pillar missing is what's happening with the patient behavior with diet and physical activity and sleep and navigation, and appropriately getting to appointments. And I'll give the example actually from my years at Penn. There was a really big difference in the quality of the outcomes that would happen between allogeneic versus autologous transplant patients. And when you go to the tumor board and talk and find out kind of what's going on, why do the allogeneic patients have better outcomes? It seemed to have to do with the fact that they were being navigated to a class led by a nurse who was referred to as a sergeant. I'm not kidding. Who was very, very strict about, what the diet needed to be, what the home environment needed to be, kind of, movement and rehabilitation needed to be happening. And these patients would get to 100 days out from their transplant and be in beautiful shape. And meanwhile, with autologous transplants, we're being released from the hospital and, without of navigation, without the same kind of guidance, and having great deal more difficulty getting to 100 days being safe and healthy. And so I think that there is some very low-tech partnership that needs to be happening, that I think Dr. Chambers would certainly agree with me, as well as Dr. Hughes Halbert.
Okay, great. I think probably getting to what might be my last question is more focused on students. So we've heard today off and on bits about, how do you think about these things in terms of aspiring scientists and what kind of careers can be had here. And what strikes me is, so I myself have a pretty, let's say, interdisciplinary background. I did my undergraduate degree in biology, went to graduate school for chemistry, and now I'm getting into data science in various ways, for example. So where I see a lot of interesting thing is at those intersections. So I think as a student, it can be tempting to say, well, I want to do it all, right? I want to really try and take in all those things. And that, of course, has its limits. So what would be, you're at various stages in your careers, what would be your advice to students about, especially undergraduate students here at Gustavus? What would be your advice to them in terms of if they're interested in these fields that we're talking about today, what should they do next? How should they approach the next couple of years? Easy question.
I'll take a stab. I actually would reframe the question as, what is your passion for a question to solve? And then get the skills that you need in order to solve the question. So you mentioned chemistry and biology. As you now know, there's chemical biology and there's computational biology. You can't be an expert in all three, but you can have the ability to talk the language and understand how to construct a question, and then find the right collaborator for the part you're missing.
Okay, great.
Yeah,
I agree. Good collaborators are sometimes hard to come by, but invaluable. Totally agree. Other thoughts?
I mean, I definitely follow.
I think Jim Thomas just started.
No, it's all right. Yeah, I think following your passion for sure, but I think an intellectual curiosity, I mean, that's something really important to feed, and I do think the cross-discipline aspect of so much science now, we're out of, just strict disciplines, and one of the things I was attracted to in biotechnology many years ago was it was the melting pot of science, right? And across these different disciplines, from engineering to, very basic at that time, molecular biology, immunology, and so forth. So I would say yes, sample a lot. You can't be an expert in everything, but sample a lot and move toward your passion, and where your skill set is, and follow it with rigor and have fun. Just have fun learning.
Okay, any other thoughts on that topic?
I guess I would add, very quickly that I think that I've had to retool. I would bet that there's going to be some nodding by the panelists that over the course of my career, I've had to learn how to be a manager. I've had to learn to be, do budgets. I've had to learn, now I'm learning about health services and implementation science and, So I think what you do your undergraduate degree in, or what you start off. I've got to believe that Jim Thomas has had to learn how to do a whole host of things that he didn't originally train in order to do the work that he. So be ready to lifelong learn, I guess.
Okay, Dr. June, you want to jump in there?
Yeah, I would just say it's changed since I think when Jim and Charles and I started off at the bench, it was much more of a foxhole thing, and now team science has really become, emerged, and like the project Charles talked about, where all these sequences and now other people, you can crowdsource, but working in a team environment is really important, getting those skills. I think there's some things you have to go deep on, and that maybe, but if you can work with other people, it will really, it's both fun, it's international, and it's how you can solve complex problems.
Great, see a lot of nodding.
And if I may,
sure.
if I may just add one small thing, especially just emphasizing what Charles started off saying, which is don't get too seduced by something that you think is the in field, right? Because what is in now when you're a student is going to be completely gone in 10 years' time, and it's going to be replaced by a field that none of us have thought about today. So I think, just emphasizing what Charles said about actually find out what is it that you're desperate to solve. What is it that you can't stop yourself thinking about, and just get whatever tools you have, and train in something, be strong in something, but that's it. Don't chase the fashion, chase the problem that you want to solve.
All right, well, great. Thanks so much for this very rich discussion. We'll have another opportunity tomorrow, and I guess it's over to you.
Thanks. Thanks very much, panelists, and I look forward to doing this again tomorrow. Take good care, and we'll enjoy watching the rest of your talks over the next day. So thank you. Thanks, Dwight.
Thank you.
Thanks, Lisa.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thanks so much.
So that leaves us with a little bit of time to have a conversation with my colleague Laura Burek, who will be joining me in just a moment. That concluding conversation, though, was very interesting to me because I think about the ways in which a liberal arts education really does invite the kind of cross-disciplinary, interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary, non-disciplinary thinking that all of our presenters were talking about. It's interesting to me that Professor Charles Sawyers, Dr. Charles Sawyers, I should say, was actually a history student in his undergraduate degree. And he said, there are ways in which learning how to solve those puzzles, the puzzles that you solve when you're writing an undergraduate bachelor's thesis, and you're looking at original manuscripts in the library, manuscripts that maybe no one has looked at for 100 years, is also a kind of puzzle solving. He describes himself as a puzzle solver. So I think that there really is a way in which that liberal arts education gifts you, well, maybe not gifts with you, gives you the opportunity to develop some really impressive tools in your toolbox, tools that enable you to ask those questions. One of the things that I'd really like to ask our speakers, though, is how do you cultivate a passion when you're not sure that you have one? I think it's a wonderful idea, and I also know that when I work with students, sometimes they might be afraid to have a passion, or they might really say, I'm not sure what having a passion looks like. So stay tuned. Maybe I'll have a chance to ask them that question soon enough. Now I'm, I think, joined by my colleague, Laura Burek, who is here to do a little debrief about what she just heard. I feel like the NPR reporters who now say, Laura, what did you hear? What did you hear in that discussion that interested you?
I think one thing that I found fascinating was sort of the recurring theme of the importance of medical records. So sort of returning to the different ways in which they can be used, both if we think to Chanita Hughes Halbert's talk earlier today, where she talked about sort of text mining those for indications of patient loneliness or lack of support or things like that, to being a place where you can potentially see implicit bias, where you see the differences between what's been written down versus what's actually expressed from the patient perspective, all the way to the genomic data and thinking about how do you sort of take that genomic data and sort of put it together. And so I think that it's really interesting to think about because those patient records are potentially so important for doing all of this different type of research, but also we want to think about protecting the privacy of these patients. Like, how do you actually do this research while remaining sort of truly anonymous, and all those types of issues too? Because especially if you think about genomic data, people that are experts in genomic data can identify people based on just the genomic data that's there. And so how do you balance all of these different issues, I think is one thing that struck me from the sort of day as a whole.
Indeed, on that last point, isn't it the case that some murderer was discovered because he had been, his genome had been sequenced by one of these Ancestry.com or one of those sources? Do you remember that story?
Yeah, so that was a story that came out a few years ago, where essentially they used DNA from a crime scene and then uploaded it into an ancestry database and sort of found distant relatives. That's certainly not the only case that has been solved in that sort of way. And the database that's been used actually had a data breach not so long ago and some issues with their privacy settings. So that's a really big, complicated area. That could probably be a whole nother Nobel Conference someday.
Indeed. Now I'm really worried about having sequenced my dog's DNA. Oh, ampersand, I'm sorry. Another thing I heard Dr. Sawyers say, Charles Sawyers say with respect to that is the difficulty. What did he say? It's filled with gold nuggets, that patient data, and it's much more difficult to trawl and to identify pieces of information. I was interested in Dr. Hughes Halbert's discussion of natural language searches and other ways to, I assume, make it easier to get at the information that we actually need. And obviously, when you're the patient and you're trying to answer those questions, I know I always struggle over those patient questionnaires because I think, how do I say this exactly in a way that will actually manifest that the pain is an 8.5, or, that I felt it 3 times. I think we as patients really struggle because we realize the importance of that, and yet on the other end of things, the difficulty of actually making any sense out of all that information is really quite insurmountable, I would think.
It could be an example where some of the digital humanities work that's occurring might actually be a place where there could be a really good intersection between medical research and some of the digital humanities approaches to trying to think about all these different, what does the text mean sort of questions. So might be another little tiny plug for the liberal arts.
What a lovely, that was a lovely softball, Laura. That's a really great point. That's a really great point. I know that Dr. Al-Lazikani, when she talks about her knowledge base as distinct from a database, is going to talk quite a lot about the number of kinds of data, and indeed one of the really important ones is patient data. Great. What else? I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say that point. Also, I was really struck by Jim Thomas's talk today when he was talking about the way in which artificial intelligence can be used to think about how to design an antibody because they're so complicated. And he gave the example of the faces, where essentially you could have a computer regenerate a human face from scratch, and I couldn't tell the difference. I was sitting watching the talk, and I thought maybe B, and then it turned out all of them were regenerated. And so I think that that's one more example of potentially the power of artificial intelligence that has sort of been demonstrated that I'm sure we'll get even better look at tomorrow.
Now, I know Dwight asked a question about this, but I wonder if you want to drill into it a little bit more. Can you talk about some of the kinds of concerns that people might be having? Now, he talked about false negative, but what might be some of the other concerns? I mean, I know that with AI, we know all kinds of worries when, for instance, it's being designed to recognize faces, and we know that systematically faces of color are under-recognized. But what might there be concerns also in using this kind of technology with respect to identifying molecules?
I think there's not necessarily the same privacy issues when you're thinking about identifying molecules because they're not people or things like that.
Right.
But I think that one of the things to think about is when you're thinking about all these molecules, like we can see things as humans sometimes that machines have a difficult time doing. So one of the very few things that humans are still like maybe better at than computers is pattern recognition. And so that's sort of the basis of some of the like, are you a robot tests when you have to like click the crosswalks and things like that. And so I think that there's still that question of, is the computer really doing a better job of getting the pattern recognition or not? And so who do you trust? And so I think that as more and more data is accumulated, as more and more sort of small molecules are available, as more and more antibodies are available, you have to think about how do you actually choose a treatment for a given patient. And so one of the things that is sort of a follow-up of that is if the computer says one thing and a doctor says another thing, how do you actually decide? And I think that sort of as treatment advances, there's that whole question of as complexity increases, how do you actually make sense of all of this information? How do you sort of take all of this information that's out there and have it in a place where people can access it? And I think that that whole complexity starts to get at some of the questions that were also raised in the panel today about what are some of the causes of the disparities. So there's ideas about where treatment occurs. Does it occur at a National Cancer Institute designated center, or does it occur at a small cancer treatment center close to where a patient lives? What is the sort of clinical trial access, where people live? How much does geographics really matter versus socioeconomic factors? There's so many different limitations. And one of them is probably simply just the complexity that if you had 3 options, everyone could know about those 3 options. Mm-hmm. But if there's 50 options for a given patient, how do you choose that? How do you make sure that there's education and databases, though, that you can actually figure it out? I think those are some of the hints at some of the future questions that are to come.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. This is a left field question, but it's one that's remaining from earlier in the day for me, and I think for some of our audience members, and that is, I've been really struck by how many of these revolutionary treatments address leukemia. And then when you look at the numbers, it's maybe not a kind of leukemia that is experienced by very many people. Why is it, Laura, that these therapies are being successful first with leukemia? Is there a reason for that?
Yeah, so actually chemotherapy was also first tested on blood cancers as well. So I think that there's a number of different factors that go into it. One is just potentially the accessibility. So when you think about a solid tumor, it's kind of a protected environment in the middle, especially. And so if you're trying to get at the middle of that solid, it's harder to get at the middle than it is to get to a bunch of distributed cells. And so blood cancer tumors are distributed throughout the body. And so therefore, if a drug is also distributed throughout the body, then it might be easier to sort of reach all of the cells at once. So there's the distribution factor. There's also sort of the way in which mutations happen. So I think that generally speaking, the number of mutations that are present in a blood cancer is less than the number of mutations that are present in a solid tumor. And solid tumors, therefore, have more what's called heterogeneity, where there's lots of different types of cancers essentially within one tumor. And so when we think about drug resistance and things like that, I think that cancers that are more developed, including solid phase cancers, would be things that would be harder to treat with these drugs because resistance is more likely. And then when it comes to the immune system treatments, so immunotherapy, especially like the CAR T therapies, solid tumors exist in a sort of T cell restrictive environment. So it's very difficult for the T cells to work. There's lots of negative signals because in order for the tumor to have grown to that extent, it has to be producing these negative signals. So without those negative signals, you wouldn't have had the tumor. And so therefore, in addition to that sort of distance factor, there's also like sort of a T cell toxicity that surrounds the tumor that isn't there in the blood cell cancer. And so there's a lot of factors, but certainly there have been very good, especially checkpoint immunotherapies for solid tumors. So checkpoint immunotherapies are different than the ones that Carl June talked about today. And they're essentially ones that are focused at getting rid of that toxic environment. So essentially, they act upon those negative signals for the T cells. And so essentially, the tumor has all these turn off, turn off, turn off signals. And the checkpoint immunotherapy say, nope, you should turn on, turn on. And so those have been successful. And so they don't work for every patient, but there are a number of different solid tumors that have been treated very successfully with those therapies, such as certain types of lung cancer, certain types of colon cancer, melanoma.
Right. Thanks very much for that. And thanks for your overview of what's gone on so far. I look forward to having another conversation with you tomorrow after we've heard a few more talks.
Yes. Great. Excellent.
Thanks, Laura. Take good care.
Thanks, Lisa.
See you.
Bye.
So in a moment, I will welcome to the laboratory my colleague and former classmate, actually, Don Myers, who is Don is the director of the Hillstrom Museum at Gustavus, and he's here to be talking about some exhibits that have been